Well, I am here today with Elise McCall, and obviously we spoke, I think about a month ago. I can't remember when the episode was released. I think it was a week or two ago now. It's kind of jumbled up a little bit because my scheduling and things has been a bit messy because my laptop recently died. So any watchers on YouTube, the visual quality is not quite as good as it usually is, but I'm making do. Thank the Lord that Megan's got basically the same laptop as me. But with Elise McCall, so obviously we spoke a few weeks ago and a month or so ago, and we spoke because you are part of the Reburn comic. You were the artist for that, and you were the colour artist for the first issue of that as well. So it's a brief, obviously we'll say to people, go back, listen to that episode, it's a brilliant introduction. But in this one we want to get more deeply into you and some of your artwork and some of your career and your kind of view on art in a way, and the kind of artistic side of you. So is there any way that you would want to introduce yourself to our lovely listeners once again if they haven't met you before?
Yeah, I mean, my name is Elise McCall, and I'm a all-around artist. I do comic illustration, and I also paint, and I've been doing that for a long time now. You know, I'm not that old, but I have been doing it since I was pretty young.
Yeah, that's amazing. And so with your art, I mean, obviously you've been involved with a lot of projects and you've got some solo things, and there's something that I will encourage throughout this conversation, no doubt, but is people to go to your website, which is elisemccall.com. I'll put a link in the description, but you can just go through the paintings and the artwork and all of the different sort of eras of your styles, as well as some of the commissioned work as well, that I absolutely love, and it's really, really interesting being able to look through those. So linking in with that, if we go all the way back to sort of your earliest memories, in a sense, of drawing, when was that? Was that sort of doodling in class? Was that even before that? Like, where was your artistic roots of, in a sense, putting pen to paper?
Yeah, I would say that I've been doing it since I was, a kid. And I had the impression that, I thought, all kids just, love to draw and will do artistic things. But I've had a few friends tell me that they were like, not me, and that, I was just always drawing. I was always doing some sort of creative, crafty kind of project. And I was pretty fortunate. I had a very open-minded family, my whole, the family that raised me, at least, they had a lot of artists in their family history. So at a young age, when I was already doing things like sculpting or drawing, they were incredibly supportive and yeah, that's great. You should keep doing that, where that can be a little iffy for some people I knew, growing up in our present society, feeling a lot of people see art as a sort of one-way trip to poverty. And so, they weren't necessarily encouraged and supported by their families to do it. I knew a lot of people in school who would feel like their parents were like, why are you doing this? Whereas my family was always really no, that's great. And it was natural because there were artists in our family history. We had these old drawings from the early 1900s, and it kind of was this continuity, and so yeah. So I started doing that, and then I started to seriously be I want to draw I want to be an artist with a capital A when I was about 12, I think, because I had gotten into things like comic books, and I loved reading comics. I loved the art in them. And I started just kind of copying the things that I saw. And then I started being well, this is awesome. How do I keep doing this? And then how do I draw things that aren't already on paper? So how do I look at something and be I want to draw that? How do I draw a face? Because that's super complicated and hard. And so that's when, about the age when I started being reading books about it and seeing how people did it. And then I was really fortunate. I got into a high school that kind of focused in the arts and specialized in it. So I got some kind of more focused education on it.
That's incredible. Yeah, it's amazing when you have that sort of that support about something that is, obviously careers which are the more conventional careers usually get some degree of support from the family, be it just morale or otherwise, because it's deemed as a worthy venture in certain ways. Whereas, as you said, with art, a lot of the time it can be perceived as a hobby, not necessarily a career or something you can, not the money is the be all and end all, but a lot of family values and a lot of families do focus a lot on, is what you're doing generating revenue? Are you making money? Can you support yourself, etc.? So the fact that you had family members who not only obviously had experience in art anyway, but were willing to support that and sort of give air to the flame, in a sense, to be able to allow you to go sort of that route. Must have really, really helped with that. And did you learn anything from the more artistic ones in the family, or was it more of a kind of a boost, just them being behind you, less so than the teaching sort of style?
Yeah, I would say it's kind of like a little bit of both because, so I've talked a lot about my mom. My mom has schizophrenia, and I've always thought that, like, there's a lot of things that are challenging about that experience, but the thing that has actually, I think, really benefited me as an artist is that my mom is really creative. She's really open-minded about things. And she knows how to draw, but she would always kind of like poo-poo herself. She would say like, oh, I'm not good at this stuff, or she is really like hard on herself. But I was always like, as a kid, like, you're really good, like I want to do this too. And the way that I feel like I kind of was taught in some ways by her is just like having that openness is really essential to creativity, because I briefly worked at a paint your own ceramic studio, like a kind of kitschy like little thing. And I would see parents come in with their kids, and so often, like, they'd get their little sculpture and they'd start painting it, and their parents would be like, no, you can't paint your dog blue, dogs aren't, they're brown, paint your dog like this color, you have to do the red collar, like they would really kind of hover and control that kind of experience and be like, there's a right way to do this. And I was like, wow, my mom was so much more like, yeah, do a blue dog, do like weird stuff. I like this random little doodle you did, and that kind of like openness, I think, is actually really conducive to creativity and being able to kind of just explore.
Yeah, it's all about, with being a parent. I mean, I don't have kids. Myself and Megan will potentially go down that route at some point, but we're kind of, we've got a dog now, so that's enough for the time being. But when we go down that route and have kids and things, it's always a tricky thing of boundaries and the degree of guiding your child outside of, with your experience, and guiding them with what and things, without trying to control them and make them, like, force them. There's, the age-old adage, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. You can allow kids have these opportunities to be an artist, or to be a musician, or to play sports or something like that. But if they're not feeling it, and they're not in their sort of, they're not kind of allowed to explore and kind of do what they sort of want in that space in the right way, then it can just backfire, and it doesn't work. And things like forcing a child to this thing they're creating, to force them from the start to be like, nope, these are the rules, you have to do this. It's like, it immediately just cuts off lines of where one's own thought processes can go, and really connecting to the imagination, I'd say.
Absolutely. And I would even, like, so much of like learning how to draw is like the skills are not as hard as you would think they are to learn, but it's a psychological battle to learn how to draw and to become like, learn those skills. Because I talked about it with a friend way back in the day who was into acting, right? And he was saying that like acting is a nice thing for children because they don't have to watch themselves act. You can act, and and you don't have to like be confronted with your performance. Whereas with drawing and art, you have to look at your failure constantly, and it's really it can be really brutal. And I found that, like, more so than anything, people are so hard on themselves. Like, the first thing that whenever I tell people that, like, oh, I'm an artist, I draw and such, I'm always confronted with this line of like, I can't even draw a straight line, or like, oh, that's so cool, like I can't do this, or I can't do that. Like, people are just so hard on themselves because they have this sense of like, I don't know, some sort of internal critic, or maybe a family member who was a critic, that there is such a feeling that you have to like overcome in order to just keep, kind of pushing through that discomfort.
It's very well put. And I think this connects nicely into maybe dissonance is the wrong word, but the internal struggle that all artists have in sort of this capitalist society, which I'm not necessarily critiquing. There are many benefits to the society in which we live in, but obviously the main driving force of this is what we mentioned earlier, which is money. So how does one, as an artist, as someone who specifically their passion is to create art in the many various ways there are, which are one of the purest forms of self-expression, how do you get that into a commercial sense? How did the kind of journey go for you of going from, I can create these things and people around me appreciate them and I feel like I'm achieving something from this creation, to I'm now going to take directions from someone to have this sold in a commercial sense? How did that kind of transformation go for you?
That's a good question. I mean, like that's a kind of ongoing like process for me because it's challenging, you know. It's like finding that right balance of maintaining your, you know, personal voice while also, you know, trying to get jobs and work within, you know, an industry like for instance with like illustration or comics. Yeah, I mean, it's been a lot of like trial and error for me. I was pretty lucky though, like, because I went to an arts focused high school, you know, and then I went on to pursue a bachelor's of fine arts degree. So I got more training from professionals who, you know, you get these mentorships to learn, like, okay, like, how are other artists in the field, how are they doing it? And I was, you know, I was still trying to find my path, but I met a lot of people who kind of like gave me some of the structure, some of the like know-how of like, how do you do your taxes as a creative person, you know, because that matters. You can't just like ignore that, you know. And yeah, but like but I, you know, it's hard. A big part of it, I would say, is probably networking and meeting people, going to like events. Like I would go to, in the early days, like comic conventions, and just try and go to those and talk to various artists who are industry professionals and, you know, get excited about their work and ask like how they did it, you know, and it kind of, you know, that can be informative. And then, you know, there's, at least in my area, I was lucky enough that there were kind of other networking events, you know, where it'd be like drink and draws, where you could go to a gallery or something and there's other artists and everybody's kind of doing stuff. Because I feel like most of the jobs that I ended up getting came from, you know, one-on-one conversations. And that's not, you know, for everyone. I know a lot of people, like, they have to, you know, utilize the internet more and that's more maybe a comfortable place for them. But for me, it really has kind of been linked to face-to-face interactions.
That's very interesting, because from what I understand of what Alyson has spoken about you is that you are more of an introverted individual in general. So putting yourself out there to foster collaboration is what it sounds like, a lot of it, because in the arts, be it music or any of the sort of other various ways in which people express themselves, and that's basically a way to, in the professional sense, either make money or sort of make a project worthwhile. It is all a collaboration. Obviously, the further you scale up, there become companies and things and corporations who then commission certain works and etc. to make the highest amount of money, but you also have to follow usually the strictest structure, and you kind of scale down and it becomes this more of an openly collaborative thing, less so than a, you know, here's a picture, every single thing here is numbered to exactly what paint, like color almost. You have no freedom, you just have to do this thing, and if you can't, we'll get someone else in the row. So with that in mind, sort of, we'll link it to Reburn in a good way, which is obviously when you collaborated with Alyson Shelton on that, as well as Jessica as well, whose surname escapes me at the moment, so apologies for that. It's the Reburn comic in itself. Jessica Patel, and then there was Hilary Jenkins who did the color work for issues 2 to 4. It was that collaborative project that you did for Reburn and with Alyson. Was that an example of something that happens quite frequently in your career so far, or was that more of a special case of someone you really, or people that you really connected with on that sort of on that basis?
Yeah, with them, I mean, like, it was funny. I mean, part of what happened there is that they actually, they reached out to me, and I was one of, a couple artists they were probably reaching out to because they had seen other work I had done. And that's a big part of it too, is like kind of once you get that in and start moving, like you start to have a little more like people start to word of mouth hear about you, or like they see your work and then they reach out, so it's really helpful to get that initial in, to start that. And then when they reached out, I do get approached about projects, and sometimes I can already feel out like, oh, this probably isn't for me, or I can be like, in the case of Reburn, I was like, oh yeah, this feels like it could be cool. And it helped a lot that we could meet over things like Zoom and stuff, because most of our early conversations, it was almost like we weren't even talking that much about Reburn, yet we were almost feeling each other out and having just these long conversations about philosophies and our worldviews and things that were just coming up in our lives. And that kind of can help you, I think, as an artist, get a feel for, oh, this is a collaboration that can work, because so much about collaborating and dealing with, like I've heard the term like knowledge work, which is, stuff that's a little abstract. It's not like, it's not a paint by numbers situation. It's a like, oh, we have to make something out of nothing. And in that situation, you can be very vulnerable. It's really, it can be really challenging. There are long nights spent awake just trying to get something done, and so you really want to, like, I've found that the best thing to do is like really make sure that the people you're working with from the start, like you're on the same page. You kind of can understand, you can communicate easily and have similar communication styles. And I really felt that with the Reburn crew. It was really an awesome collaboration because we could just easily talk. And so then when things, like let's say we're like stuck on a point, like, oh, like what is this character supposed to look like? Or like, what is this setting supposed to be? How is this technology supposed to exist in this world? Like you can kind of find the overlap in the conversation, the points of like, well, this piece of media, and it's like, oh, I know all about that. I really, I exactly know what you mean now. And so that's really important.
Yeah, using others' art in a sense to be able to more figure out where they're coming from. Because one thing I mentioned, I believe briefly in the Reburn conversation we had with Alyson, and I'll link to that and obviously the Reburn comic and things like that in the description and show notes and things. But in that conversation, one of the things that we discussed was character creation, and that was something that very much intrigued me. And as you've sort of mentioned there, because what I said in this other conversation as well was that when you're an artist, especially someone who's either commission based or is doing comics or things like that, you are basically a translator in a lot of ways, especially when it's a new IP. When it's something that hasn't been drawn before or seen before in other media, you have to be able to understand what they're saying. And unless they are, there are certain creators, one I think of is Dave Filoni, obviously, who makes Rebels and Star Wars Clone Wars and things. He's a fairly good artist. I think he draws, he's more of a storyboard kind of guy, but he has done some artwork and things that is quite cool. So when he's trying to explain something to the art department, he can basically draw it in a lot of ways, and that really helps them. But I think probably the majority of individuals who are in the writer's seat or that sort of area may not be able to draw to a example of, say, Dave Filoni, of that kind of middle ground. So when there's that kind of situation, when you work with people like Alyson or others who can't draw as air quotes professionally, I don't know how much Dave Filoni, I keep using him as an example because it's just the middle ground guy I can think of. How do you kind of translate that, especially with character creations? Obviously you mentioned about the media, but do they also try and draw like stick figures and things like that? Or is that kind of counterproductive in some ways? Like if someone isn't as artistically talented as yourself, is that a helpful thing, drawing itself, or is it more of a, like, how does that work, if at all?
Yeah. Well, it's like, I think a lot of the times, like for character creation and that kind of stuff, we would oftentimes, it's like triangulate between like images of well-known like characters or people, so like that's something that they could like easily be like, oh, like this celebrity in this role, right? Like, or this character from this series, or like this character has this kind of vibe, and that kind of is enough for me to be able to interpret and usually start to get close. And I would do a couple different versions of what I kind of thought that they were meaning. And from there, we were usually able to kind of be like, oh, like this, but maybe not so that, you know? And in the case of, you know, providing art, I have worked with people who can like, will sometimes provide maybe like, not for character creation, so to speak, but maybe more for panel structure and like the pacing of like what they were imagining, you know. And that was in some of my earlier projects where it'd be like I'd get some like I do a piece or like I do a page structure and it'd be like, that's not quite what we were looking for. And then, you know, they'd give me just like a quick, like, you know, because you don't, with storyboards and with comics, I mean, it's not really about the art. It's like, you know, it can be an important feature. And certainly people love really beautiful, evocative art. But like, there's also amazing comics out there where it is just kind of like stick figures and they rely more on like the wit and the pacing and the panel structure. And so, you know, I can really use a lot from, you know, people, like what they're kind of imagining, like, oh, I want the figure kind of like here. And if it's just like a weird, you know, wonky little figure, that's fine because that's not necessarily what's important. It's like that is for a comic, you know, it's that structure, that pacing, that like, you know, shot composition essentially.
That's very interesting. And with sort of your painting and your styles and your artwork, obviously things like Reburn, I presume, those were obviously the sketches and things. Actually, I don't know. With Reburn, was it all digital, like 100% of the artwork you did?
Well, it became digital because I find that working digitally later is like easier because you can move through the deadlines quicker. But in the early process, I try to hand draw as much as possible because that helps me find the image easier. Because digital, I mean, I don't know how, you know, like I know a lot of people have different relationships with it because I come from a traditional art background. It helps me, I kind of can think better when I draw or I paint or I, you know, work with materials to start to find the character, or when I'm doing thumbnailing, I have to sketch it out in my sketchbook. I have to use pencil and paper. Like I've tried to do like digital storyboards, or like, and it's so frustrating for me because I can't. It's so easy to start to get nitpicky with digital because you can just endlessly like edit and correct, and you know you zoom in, and when you zoom in, you're trying to. It's like I'm trying to get details that don't matter, you know, and it's so much nicer I find with graphite and pencil if I'm like just trying to sketch something out really quick because I can be less precious about it. But once I've had enough time to kind of think with materials, like with drawing materials or painted stuff, then I feel like I get to that core image of like what I'm trying to do, then I can jump into digital and it feels like, oh, okay, now I have the plan, I have the blueprint.
Interesting, because one would assume would be the opposite because of how digital there is that readiness to be able to, you know, Control Z it, just undo that. Oh, that was rubbish. You know, one button, gone. Whereas when you do it with graphite or with painting or things like that, you can adjust if you make an error, but you can't just undo. And so if I wasn't me, and it's going to make sense after this, but if I wasn't me, I would say that sounds in reverse. But with myself, one thing I often show guests, and I may have shown you before, is just my notebooks. I've got loads of these. I all my show notes for all my podcasts, and I do it with different color pens. So it's all like written, and there's like scraggly tiny bits written down in different places because I like the freedom of being able to just, add something here and there, and you can kind of see what goes where and what's important to where. Like, I know it's a different thing to art, but like when I'm writing down notes, it's like being able to do it physically. It's my rules. If I want to write a word in giant letters over everything, I can just do that. But on a Word document or a notepad file, it's not the same. And there's a degree of freedom that comes from just pen on paper. And I find that when I'm writing things down, things always flow to me better when I'm thinking of guests for podcasts and things. I don't write them on my phone first. I get a notepad and I write them down there. And then when I then want to kind of action them, then I put them on my phone. So there is something about, I mean, I'm not much of a drawer. I do a bit, but not anything good at all. But with pen on paper, I just think it's something, or pencil on paper, there's just something about putting it physically in front of you that I don't think matches with anything else. So with art, it's a whole nother level.
Yeah, no, but I mean, I think you're probably better than you think. Again, like coming back to what I was saying, that people are their harshest critics when it comes to making stuff. But like literally, I mean, I've talked about this in like college, where you start to get into like the theory around art and image making. Like drawing is just mark making on paper, right? So technically writing is drawing. So like everybody's always like, I'm not an artist, so I don't know. It's like, do you write your signature? Do you like, write notes? I mean, that's drawing, there. And we've started to see, especially in the last like 100 years, these like dissolving of these boundaries, and so many artists, like they play with that, push and pull. So I do think that I agree with you that there's something very direct about drawing, because it's so intuitive. You just need to have like a surface and a pen, and you can make marks, and that's so like refreshing. Whereas like with digital, you're interfacing. You've got this like this machine, this device, all these different like apps and programs, and all this noise that can be a little distracting when you're trying to really just let the thoughts flow and not be so, you just kind of need it to be easy and free form. And then you can kind of organize it later. And that's why I find like, this technology is really useful for that. But like, I don't see it completely replacing like that physicality, that material, because, we're still physical beings. Like we kind of have these like intuitive relationships with stuff.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. And with that, so on your website, you've got drawings and you've also got paintings. Do you have a preference to graphite on paper, to painting and things? And if so, what is it about that you prefer?
Well, I would say that, I mean, like I was saying, that there's these boundaries, or they're so like fragile, they're so like at this point, drawing and painting, they're kind of the same thing, but like there's, maybe minutia you could get into of how they're different. But I would say that I've always seen myself as somebody who draws, like I'm a draftsman. I'm somebody who can really draw a lot of things, but in recent years started to feel almost like maybe like I had done a lot already, and I was feeling like a lack of challenge. It was like, oh, I want to do something more. And that's when I've started to really love and adore painting, because painting adds this level of complexity with color and managing color. And then of course, learning how to do something like oil painting is probably like the pinnacle of challenge, because there's so many different it's like one part art and then one part chemistry, right? And you're having to like learn a lot of stuff and navigate a lot, and I find that really exciting, because it's like it's a nice challenge, and it kind of pushes me where my drawing, like I had gotten to a certain point with it where I've started to feel like, oh, okay, well, like what now, and I feel excited with painting more so, but I do but drawing is always like, a really important part of that process as well. Like you need to do I need to do a lot of sketches and a lot of iterations, and working with things like I do a lot of graphite work ahead of in anticipation of putting paint on a surface.
Yeah, nice practice just to kind of be like, well, I want to go with this, because they're almost the inverse, aren't they? Because graphite is at its purest form outlines, and then you can add more detail as you go more into the minutiae of it. But with just a simple pencil and a bit of paper, it starts off as lines, whereas colour's the opposite. Painting's the opposite, it's colour. You get colours first, and obviously when you put a paintbrush down, that can be a line, but that's a block of colour, more so how one perceives it initially. So it becomes the two completely opposing forces of one is outlines and one is pure color. And so with that, obviously, it's easier to be, say, precise in certain ways with the graphite. And with the painting, where there's no clear end to a color, that's when it becomes, I'm imagining, more freeing, but also somewhat more challenging if you haven't got exactly what you want in your mind. But equally, because it's freeing, it can potentially get you out of a block in some way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, painting can be so, it's like painters and like people I know who are painters, we all kind of like get a little shy about this particular feature of it, but it feels like painting talks back to you, and it feels like woohoo, haha, like, a little meta, I guess, but it's so true because the way paint moves and behaves, it has a lot of, properties and characteristics that are unique to it that kind of start to come they're out of your control, right? In a way that, like, maybe with, like, if I have a pencil and I'm like really getting into some fine detail, like I kind of have a lot more control in that case. But with paint, it can be its own, like I do something and it's like, oh, that's like weird. But like, that's part of the beauty of it, because it becomes almost like a conversation with the material. And again, it sounds a little like woo-ha, like weird and such, but I really appreciate that, because almost it becomes a collaboration with the material, and like we were talking about collaboration earlier. It keeps it interesting, because if I'm just like in total control, like I honestly usually don't like what I come out with, because I'm sort of like, like, look at that. It was, I had this idea and now it's there, and it's not as interesting as I thought it was, Whereas sometimes if you're in a conversation, whether it's with an actual person or with paint, you are surprised. And then you can kind of, if you're like willing and open enough, you can kind of live with those strange happenstances, and those things might actually be the thing that make the work good. Yeah.
No, I mean, it doesn't sound silly to me at all. And I think that it's a perfectly reasonable thing to say. I mean, how is it any different from going outside and nature inspiring you to do something? There's a concept. My own personal religious and spiritual beliefs are hand wavy. I don't believe in a God. I just believe we're kind of beings of energy. We all came from the same point, and we've all just, the Big Bang or whatever happened, and then we're all just shooting out off in all directions all at once, and we just we've got life, and it's just a big nice happy coincidence, but let's just do what we can with it, and then we all just eventually fold up back into the same point where energy is never destroyed, it's always transferred, so we're all each other in some form, just over billions of years plus. So when I think of the universe and I think of all these sorts of other elements, one thing that always strikes me is imagination. And it's the ideal, I think, a lot of individuals who are religious, they believe it's the voice of God. A lot of spiritual beings, people who are obviously still human beings, they believe in maybe other beings are speaking to them, or other planes of reality or whatever. And obviously a lot of people who end up using psychoactive drugs, they say, you get inspiration from DMT from the other realms, or with psilocybin mushrooms, any of these sort of things, no matter how one kind of goes to this degree of elevated way of consciousness. You can even do it obviously through meditation as well and things like that. It all comes from something, somewhere, telling you to do something. When I started podcasting, I've described it as the pull. I just had this feeling, this thing. I just felt like it should be something I should be doing. When people ask me, I've got a reason, because if I always just say I felt like I should, it makes me sound like I'm like self-proclaiming of the podcast prophecy child. It's more just this thing of it feels right to do, and from doing this thing, loads of great things in my life have happened. And I'm not saying a god or a celestial being is speaking to me, but there's this feeling of imagination and this feeling of what beyond what you want, some sort of almost like a desire that's not a control of yours. You just kind of feel it sometimes. You feel a good feeling sometimes, you feel bad feelings. With podcasting, it was this. And I feel like with artwork, especially, and with the painting, the paint is speaking with you because you're just kind of when you are in that, and you can either get into a flow state, if one wants to call it that, or whatever, you block out the static of the rest of the world. You are kind of hyper focusing in either on the world around you or introspectively, or however one may be, depending on what one is painting and the artist themselves. But it becomes this sort of thing where you open yourself up in a way that's different to the normal way, say, one communicates in the modern world, speaking to each other, having to do these things. When you're by yourself and you're painting, you are just letting free whatever thoughts or whatever inspirations come in, and it's kind of this machine in your mind where it's translating imagination and things you're getting from your senses into a manifestation on the paint. So I agree that you must be talking to the paint in that kind of way in a communication. So yeah, to me, it doesn't sound silly at all. It just connects to the wider imagination and how people do things, in a sense.
Yeah, no, I mean, well, I appreciate that. Yeah, no, it does. I do feel that, and that's kind of the heart of creativity, is just being able to be open. And then even like, I think mastery in art and various creative pursuits, because like you're talking about with the podcasting, like that is your creative pursuit that's like pulling you, like, and like the core of it is like connection with people, conversation and interaction. And that's like, I think similar to what happens ultimately with art, because you're trying to create something, interpret, and then like present it and hope that, people get the thing out of it, whether it's completely within your control or not. And so I feel pretty strongly, like, what you're talking about too, that it's like mastery in these fields comes from gaining a lot of experience doing it and being able to say like, oh, like, I can let that happen, I can, be open to being, letting the material kind of guide the process, because you've had enough experiences to see like, oh yeah, that's a good thing to pursue, like, famously Bob Ross, he called them happy accidents, right? Like, and those happy accidents are kind of like what makes art so cool, because you get to, like, for even the artist to keep it interesting, because it's like, I don't want to keep doing something that it's like is predictable and just, it becomes boring. And just in the same way I was saying with drawing, I reached a certain point where I was like, okay, like I've kind of got this on lock and I feel pretty good about it, but I'm starting to feel like bored, I guess, just like, I'm not getting the same challenge out of it. And it's at those moments that you start to push yourself into new uncomfortable territories. And it's probably why art can be so hard, because it's like you're never, if you're doing it right, I feel like you're never quite satisfied. You're always kind of in this uncomfortable place of like, oh, how's this gonna go? I don't know. And that anxiety, that stress, that nervous energy of like, will this work? But that's the part that's fun about it. And I think people, they feel that they like that tension as well. I mean, because most of the paintings or works of art that I've done, that I've been the most like, I don't know about this, like people respond the most to those pieces. And I'm like, how do they know, like, how do they see that in it?
I imagine it's partly that when an artist has got whatever it is in their mind, the perfect image, as it were, when you put it to paper, no matter how many times, if you even do it digitally or anything, no matter how many times you tweak it, it can never be perfect. Maybe, let's say at a push, and to put a number on it, you could do 95% perfect. You can never get that last 5%. That's an impossibility. But that 5% or the 10% or however many percent from the original thought you had, the air quotes perfect painting, however many percent you remove, it just means that there's almost more room in a sense for interpretation. Although I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of abstract pieces, I like it when it's abstract mixed in with other genres of painting, when I can more so see what it is. I know Dali is quite a famous abstract painter. That sort of thing's quite cool, rather than, I think there's another term for it, but when it's abstract, where it's literally just like 4 block colours of just
right,
squares.
Like Yeah,
that's
pure
too
abstraction.
much. Yeah, pure abstract is too much for me. I'm like, my thing is just like, if I could do that and that isn't speaking to me, I don't know why this exists as a thing. Whereas when it's abstract with something else, which is some of your work pieces I've noticed have got like elements of abstract part in it. When you get that, you get so much more interpretation of what you can kind of see into that, and different people with different life experiences, and even potentially how our eyes all view like versions of the color spectrum slightly differently. Things like that, just minor things that you don't necessarily think about, can tweak how one perceives a piece of art. And I think maybe it's the imperfections from that idealistic thing in an artist's mind. That's kind of the thing that allows for a lot more interpretation from others.
Yeah, definitely. And, it's like I was talking with a painting mentor of mine about something similar to this recently, that a lot of people like are kind of, we were talking about how art can't truly, at least with painting, it feels like art can't really be separated entirely from the artist. Like it has its own life, but like people want and are like eager to kind of know like who the artist is, who's the person that made it, and the kind of like mythos of the artist. And we were like, why? It can be weird that, like, especially with painting, that people want that so much. But I think it kind of comes from what you're talking about, that it's that there's a kind of humanity in knowing like who's the person and like what is the context of their life that led them to like make this thing, and I'm no different. I actually really love that, and I love reading about artists and painters and kind of how they arrived at a piece of work, because it's like there's such interesting narratives behind it, and it kind of helps helps place the artwork in that moment, so you can start to do that kind of interpretation thing and let your mind wander of like, oh wow, like, so maybe this is related to that or this, kind of psychoanalyze the painter and the work of art, because ultimately that's probably also psychoanalyzing yourself, being like, why, where are you jumping to with this, where is it taking you? Like even those pieces that you kind of like dislike, like that pure abstraction, the fact that you dislike it is an interesting thing, It's like, yeah, why am I revolted by this? Like I had a teacher who told us in college, she was like, write down the artists and the artwork that you hate, because there's actually probably something in there that is maybe even more related to what you're doing than you realize. And like I was always like, no, I hate, like I would just think about these artists that was like, no, I hate that, and I would literally do like my own work, and people would be like, it kind of reminds me of like this artist, and they meant it as like a compliment, but I was like, how dare you, like I hate that, and but there's something true in some ways. Like maybe in like I've found that in the places where I'm like disliking something or even not understanding something, sometimes it might even be like, I could do that better, or like I have like there's something about that that's like close to what I feel, but like I you want to take it your own way, and so there's this own like kind of a challenge in that too. And it's just beautiful. It's beautiful to be able to, be so in conversation with paintings and works of art, and then the people who like make that, and like, and their histories, like they tell us so much about ourselves, they're kind of like our ancestors, even if they're not directly related to us. There's something about that like human nature to create stuff that gives us so much insight into our moment too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and however you look at it, we are, to delve deeper into one of the other things I said, we are all related in some way, be it we're all humans, we're of the same species, or be it we're all carbon life forms on this planet of the countless trillions there are, we are in some ways related, or on this earth in, say, 150 years, to be generous, every single one of us is going to be dead unless something mental happens in sci-fi-esque sort of crazy stuff. But generally, we're all probably going to be gone, and we're not going to be in our forms we are now, but the carbon that makes our bodies is going to go into the dirt and things, and the atoms that make us is going to become all one. So even in a really funny abstract sense, is we are all related in that way. And so I want to kind of delve into something slightly more personal with yourself, which is shown on your website, and it's one of the ways that you have organize your artwork. So if I would recommend anyone who's listening, as long as you're not in a car or something, is to go over to Elise's website, elisemccall.com. A link will be in the description, so you can just click straight on that and go to the painting section, because they're split into 3 groupings of years. It was 2020 to 2022, and then there's also, I should have asked you this before clicking on them and going all willy-nilly, but then it's up to 2020, which was... I'm on your website, but it's taking a second to load. So unfortunately, I've just screwed myself over. Sorry, what are the three? Let
me see too.
Parts of your website of the paintings, and what can you say about each of them? Because there's a pattern, or at least an intrigue that I think I've seen from it, which groups them together, and it seems to be connections to parts of your life. So I wonder if you could just tell us sort of about these paintings in particular, why you decide to have them in 3 collections of your time. So yeah, it was 2016 to 2018 was one grouping of them, and then another grouping was before that, and then another grouping was 2020 to 2022. So what made you choose those 3 groupings, in a sense? Was it just coincidence of when you had things there, or were they, in your mind, different chapters in your life? And you don't have to say anything too personal about yourself, delve into any demons things, but whatever you wish to tell us.
Yeah, no, I mean, I have to also, I'm just quickly looking and seeing, but yeah, I think that grouping works of art by date and time is really important and helpful. A big part of that, comes from a tradition in Western art, to contextualize a piece of art by saying what era does this come from? What year does it come from? Because even year to year, a piece of art that can say a lot about the history of the moment. And so I really do feel like my art, because it's so I can be a little all over the place with my subject matter, even though I'm sure, there's continuity you can see for sure, that I tend to feel like it's more accurate to speak of periods of time, and to be able to see works of art in a period of time, to kind of see that, because, is it a progression? I'm not sure, because I think that sometimes there is a timeline, but sometimes I come back to subjects, or I come back to ways of painting, because I don't necessarily think that they're invalid, and it's not just this perfect linear growth line. It's kind of this weird, circular thing, working through my artistic journey. But I think it's helpful to still see oh yeah, this period, you can kind of see some things I was starting to get into, and then you can start to go through that journey and begin to see, oh, look at where you've arrived with some of these things, and I find it helpful, and I hope that it helps people contextualize my work and see some trends. I think ultimately one trend that's probably very evident is that I'm a figurative artist, and that I'm always painting the figure. But how I do that, does kind of start to change with each era.
Yeah, I agree. That was one of the things that I had listed from notes from our prior conversation that I kind of noticed when I went on your website and things. So I'm hoping that some people are actually checking out some of this artwork, because it is incredible. But it's quite interesting because it makes me think of a trilogy, because you've got the before, which is more of the figurative, more of the, I wouldn't want to say necessarily innocent, but there's not as much darkness in a sense around it. It's a lot more about the sort of the human body in things a lot more. Then the second batch of them, which is I think 2016 to 2018 grouping, I found that there's a lot more. There's one image of an individual who's kind of wrapped in a snake. It may be a statue, it may be a petrified individual, it may just be a person of maybe of the bog or something. And then there's a couple of people, there's a woman with blood on her face and things like that. So a lot of that feels kind of like the going in the darkness, the disequilibrium in a sense of the artistic journey. And then when you go to sort of the modern, I find that it's not as, once again, this is the wrong word, but almost as innocent as the first, and it's not quite as this is very oversimplification, dark as the second groupings, but you can feel the combination of some of the styles you're kind of mixing together. And one of the ones that I really appreciate, and I thought the name was very clever as well, is the hymeninium. I can't even pronounce it.
Oh, yes.
Hymen, and then neum. So it's like a flower, and obviously hymen. People should know what that is. If not, you're probably too young to be listening to this podcast. But those sort of things, and as you look in this, some of the colours are more bold, and you've still got this darkness there, but it's not quite as overt in certain ways. Obviously, there are certain paintings, like there's that red background one with the sort of white figure that's kind of either a bear or a wolf sort of thing. But you've got a lot more. The lines in some of these paintings are, in certain ways, more clear. But when the background, it's less clear, it's much more cleaner in a way, more intentional in certain degrees. And I find that the more you can see how you have improved in certain respects, in certain practice and techniques, it finds. And I want to clarify, please take what I say with a pinch of salt, because I've not been to art school or any those sort of things, so the terminology I use may not be ideal, but I just think it's more matured, and it feels like these two eras have kind of come together to something which really brings about some of the elements that I really appreciate from the earlier, more figurative elements, and then the middle sort of darker elements. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that, really.
Yeah, no, I mean, by the way, I mean, you would say you didn't go to art school, but you would have fooled me. I mean, like the way you talk, and it's like, and that's what I always try to encourage people, is that there's no like wrong way to talk about art. And oftentimes, like going with your, kind of your gut feelings, it's like, I find is actually always the most accurate. And you've really touched on, I feel very, thankful that you would see a lot of this stuff, and also it comes back to that kind of thing I was talking about earlier, that I'm always really amazed at how much like people and like you yourself could like pick up on certain things that, I know was like kind of present in my life, but I'm never sure if it's like really coming across, but it's kind of encouraging to hear that, that stuff is seen and felt in the work. And with those three different eras, it does kind of speak to this progression of moving through, like almost like my learning of how to paint the figure, learning how, like more academic, practice, just to get like, how does a body fit together? How do I capture light and color accurately? And then like once I get to kind of that point, in that middle stage, it's like then I can kind of start to let out some of this this angst, especially as a young person. I feel like I have a lot of it, and I do really sometimes can be maybe even on the nose about it, right? And I don't think that that's a bad thing, but it is nice to hear that you kind of have been seeing and feeling like it's progressing and evolving, because I'm trying to find that in between as well, because I don't want it to be like easily, with a painting, I don't want it to be easily dismissed, and I don't want it to be easily understood either. I think that the best part of a painting is one that can, compel you to keep looking for a little bit, and to get you to think even just beyond like, a quick glance, because it's so easy to, dismiss paintings in this age of, endless distraction. So with work, I try to do that push-pull, so that it's not clear whether this is like entirely a negative state of being, or if it's like, there's some good and beauty in it too. I don't know if that makes sense or answers your question.
No, it does. I mean, with almost all good art, you've got some degree of confliction within it in a good way. And one of your art styles, from one of the interpretations I get as well is, especially in your later work, there's a lot more about nature. There's a lot more, sort of the middle chapter in a sense. There was nature, but a lot of it was damaged and destroyed, and the sort of the woods around were forming shapes in the landscape. Whereas and also there's a lot more water as you go on. So it's kind of like I see this as well because I've been with my partner Megan for 5 years, and there's certain patterns I've seen with her of certain elements, and she's always happiest in nature, and also the two places on water or near water and or around surrounded by nature and forest. So it's all about this sort of this life feeling. And obviously a lot of these paintings, there's one which was one of Megan's favorites called Sockeye. And it was, it's a being underwater holding what looks like either a salmon or maybe I think it's something like that.
Yeah, it's a salmon.
That is a salmon. Yeah. Brilliant. Yeah. So it's these sort of things, and a lot of it is one of Megan's other favourites was the lily pad one where it's unnamed, laying on the back with pink hair, and obviously the thighs and the breasts have got pink to them as well, and just on that water and that serene and the peace and things. So it just feels like with this, it was almost like finding yourself was chapter 1 and the figurative side, and part 2 is your place in the world around you and going to, the part of the woods that have been burnt down, because there are parts that are like that. And then part 3 was almost finding your way in amidst nature, and not necessarily all of the dark parts that do inhabit it, but more so the ways in which one can coexist. And there are still flashes in a way. There's the really beautiful sort of cliffscape, the white cliffscape, and then there's the blood red sky and just the black dot in sort of the top, which could be, an eclipse. It could be, things like that. So I just find that even just these 3, and I encourage people to check out your website. There's so many cool things on there, including like your drawings themselves as well. But with these paintings, like you can go through them and keep, every time I go to the page again, I find either a new painting that I find really either speaks to me, or I find something specific about it I really enjoy. So I have found that sort of progression, it feels like not only in your art style, but even if I didn't know this was yourself, I would be like, well, this person seems like they've kind of gone through something, but they are now more comfortable in their place in the world, in a sense. And really that's all we're doing growing up, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I mean, you're so astute, and I appreciate that a lot. Thank you for, your really beautiful interpretation of it. And I would say, it's funny that you bring that up, because it's like you bring up nature, because it's almost like at this point, it's second nature to me. It's like, it's just happening now in my work. But you're right, there was this point at which I started to more intentionally incorporate nature into my work, and big surprise, it came after the pandemic, because it was like, it's terrible, what we were all going through and being like isolated and quarantined. And I started to really reevaluate a lot about interior space and being like trapped there, and being like, I started going on more walks. I don't know about you, but like I felt like I started to feel a lot more comfortable with nature and around it. And I started to feel a little more distant from things like, like social media and technology. And not that those things are bad. I still think that there's an importance they play in our lives. But I felt like, I was maybe too entrenched in the noise of the world, rather than, the moments of my world, like the space that I inhabit, which is like, I just walked in the backyard and I would see things and be like, I didn't know that happened here, like I'd see like mushrooms pop up and be like, whoa, like I didn't know that grew here. I started to see plants that I'd never noticed, or like little bugs and things. And it was like, I felt like, wow, there is so much that I've been ignoring or missing, because I've been so almost like distracted by other noise that may or may not have much importance to me. Like there's an importance in being aware of stuff in the world, but at the same time, it's like I can't really enact any change on those things. A lot of those things I can only pretty much control like where my body is right now, and that started to really change how I approach image making and making art.
It's amazing, and I appreciate your honesty there and speaking about that element with us, because nature is one of those things where I think as all humans we all have an interesting relationship with nature, because we're all kind of we're all taught that we are the top of the food chain and stuff, and it's like we're not really. We are, in air quotes, the smartest. So, there's a lot of debate with whales and dolphins and things having their own language, but not to get into the minutiae of that. Of land dwellers, generally considered the most intelligent because we are smart enough to create cages and guns, and therefore we win. Which is a pretty good argument, to be fair. Not the nicest of arguments in the animal kingdom, but it's a pretty hard one to argue with. And so, humans in themselves, like, it's almost being a human and being a person are almost two different things. Being a human is the element of you that is an animal in the sense, not saying going feral, but, like a nice dog or something, or things like that, where it's you are animal, and when one goes into nature and things, one kind of feels that connectivity. It's kind of I've described it quite a few times. I've mentioned it once, I think, in this podcast, but numerous times over my shows, is the static of being a person. Is just, there's all this in the background, there's you've got to pay this thing, and also don't forget about this person's birthday, and also this event's coming up soon, and with Christmas soon, so you need to buy gifts for this, and also don't forget about this holiday that you've got up coming up, also don't forget about your car, because that's going to go, also rent's due in this time, but also you're a little bit skint on this. It's all these little voices that you're not always necessarily hearing all the time, but it's rare that they get tuned out. There's always something buzzing there. And when you get into these scenarios where either you podcast like this, or when you draw art, or make art rather, or you do some sort of venture, a lot of people have music and things like that, you block out a lot of these things because you're hyper focusing. And what I quite like about going out into nature, be it my brother loves sitting by a stream. That's his favourite place to be, the most calming place. Megan, I think, is the ocean and whatnot. I think mine's in a forest where there's no silence, but the background noise is of just life. And everyone's got their preferred things, but it's just that way of blocking everything out. When you go through a walk in the forest, unless something quite severe in your life is potentially going on, or maybe someone has a busier mind than I, but I find that when I'm walking in the forest with either by myself or with Megan or anything like that, I just don't think about anything else, really. It's just so easy to tune in to life. The squirrel in the trees isn't worrying about taxes or worrying about electricity bills. They're kind of thinking about, I need to get nuts, I need to not get eaten, I need to climb this tree. That's more or less it. And when you're in nature and you can feel all this life around you, it's something that I find is so... People do always talk about it, but it is something I feel like people really do need a lot of the time. And when people are feeling burnt out or feeling, you can sit there and watch 10 hours on Netflix and have seen every show everyone's ever watched ever, and that's great. That's a fun thing to do. But also it's nice to just walk around and not actually have any pressure to consume this or to do that or to think about this. And I think that in your art, it's kind of that tranquility, in a sense, that kind of comes about with it.
Oh yeah. Well, thank you. I mean, that's a huge compliment, but it's something I love too about nature is that it's so, like we're of it, right? And I think we can easily be distracted and forget that we're of it. And with that, what you were talking, being a person and having to, do all these things, especially like, these social obligations that are, necessary for us to function and live, in our society. But like, we also forget that there's a sort of functionality of connecting with nature and like just moving through the world and remembering that you exist in a body, that like has needs. This comes up a lot in like, like therapy and people like talk about it, that, if you're, feeling like you're going into a terrible place or, and I can sometimes be this way, and my mind is racing. It's like, well, like, have you eaten? How much sleep have you gotten? Like, are you, hurt in any way? Are you dealing with some sort of pain? Like all those types of things. It's like, it's to ground you. And that's where I feel there's such an importance of like connecting with the humanness of us. Like you're, in your comparison, it's like saying that we exist, and it's like both parts of us, we have to find some sort of balance within it. And I think it's so easy because we're so afraid of like losing, like we have to like pay rent, we have to do things right, we don't want to get punished with like a random bill or something. It's like we disproportionately prioritize that. But I think, at the expense of overall well-being, which I feel like is, as society gets more complicated and more complex, we start to see more people are being left behind because they're just not able to keep up. And it's like, I feel that, and I'm somebody who's like able-bodied and, you know, like has a certain amount of privilege growing up in, you know, the Western world. And but like I see, you know, from my mom who struggles with, you know, schizophrenia, she is one of those people that's left behind in this society by not being able to keep up with the growing complexity. So I try to, you know, I appreciate you noticing some of this in my work. I am trying to you know, maybe put a pause, you know, bring us back to a little bit of like, you know, reflection on that natural world that's still important to us.
Yeah, and I think it's about tranquility as well, and it's calm. And, you know, if you ask the majority of people, where's the most calm place you can think of, they'll say things like, you know, sat on a field or sat in a forest, sat by the edge of a beach. A lot of the time it is people like in a cottage, surrounded by bookshelves with a nice fire next to me. It's like, well, that's, although it's humanizing it in some ways, it's still basically nature, because you're not in a, you know, few people say, yeah, I feel the most relaxed on a park bench in the middle of New York City at rush hour. It's like, that's not really very relaxing for anyone, even, you know, high flyers of that sort of area and caliber. It's just, there are common threads of what makes a human being relaxed, and it's just quite interesting that there's so many things we put in the way to prevent that, even though I understand that I'm not an anarchist and things. I think society could probably be run a lot better than it is, but that's a whole conversation that lasts eternity, really. But I want to ask, sort of, in some of your work, and something we touched upon in our prior conversation, is the idea of sort of still linking in with the art is alternate realities and things. And so I want to ask, with your artwork and whatnot, obviously there are a lot of it's very human and a lot of figuresque, but also it's, you know, there are more abstract areas, but it's still kind of in that through line of humanity. I mean, there's another one on the more recent photos of the green-skinned individual holding a mushroom of some sort. It's yellow in the background, and then you've got the sort of two cats on either side. Like, a lot of these are either deeply human, because the one next to it is of, you know, a human figure laying, it looks like maybe on a lake or something like that. And then you go down and there's human elements, but it's sort of an alternate version of reality in some senses. So do you find that with, obviously, it's kind of a trick question, because some of your artwork, you do write for comics, which it's in itself its own sort of version of reality. But with your artwork and your paintings, especially ones on your website, or the ones that you do for you, do you feel as if a lot of these, we don't have to tell us if some do, if some of them are the same being in a different reality, the same or different being in the same reality? Is that kind of, do you frame it in that? Is it that much of a conscious thought, or is it so much more abstract and free than that? It's not that simple in a way.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I would say that, well, you know, for starters, with, you know, kind of what you're getting at with the fantasy elements that are still in this kind of like almost sci-fi, you know, larger than reality, but still grounded in it, kind of, these elements are really important to me because I'm a comic artist and I am so still interested in storytelling and illustration. But I wanted to find a place for it to exist alongside my fine art practice, you know, because I think that, you know, I'm the same person making this stuff, so I have just these common interests, and bringing them into the same space, you know, like, I obviously, like, a painting can't be, well, I mean, maybe it could, but like, I don't really see, I'm not making a comic page and doing you know, it has a different function, different form. But the underlying themes that I'm interested in, which is sort of like, you know, fantasy and this like larger than life mythological figures, and, you know, kind of, you know, like these metaphors of like creatures and fantasy things that I kind of create, you know, as stand-ins for bigger ideas. You know, that's present in both things, because that's more of an abstract idea that I'm dealing with, rather than just, you know, the actual nuts and bolts of how the art form works. So that comes up a lot. And then to answer what you were saying about, like, is this like the same reality, or is it like, are these the same figures? You know, like, a big part of that is that, like, a lot of these figures, they are and they aren't like me, you know, to some extent. They're like, I use my likeness or likenesses of people who are close to me, like my husband, and such, because they're where I see myself, I see my husband, and I like, I'm easily like accessible for like looking and when I'm working on a piece. But like, and these are kind of like alternate versions of myself, or things that I see in like I want to explore, or I'm curious about. But like I like to push it into a little more fantasy, because then it's not so stuck with me. So people aren't just seeing like, well, that's your face. It's like instead they can start to maybe put themselves in the piece as well, and see like, oh, well, like, I mean, this is just this kind of fantastical being, like a vampiress or something like that. That is not just, this is you, because it's not always about me. It's also like, it's about these ideas of like nature and some of the things we've been talking about.
Yeah, and as you say that, I was just looking at because I've been focusing quite a lot on the paintings element of this, even though I think when we spoke for Reburn, I'd looked at your your graphites and inks in more detail on things. So I was just sort of, as you were speaking there, I was just taking a look at some of the differences here. And for, say, the graphite, as an example, it seems to be, I know there is at least one here, which is also with the painting. I think it was actually my favourite one, the Hymenium
Yes.
one. And so, but with this, I noticed there are certain elements here which I didn't see quite as evidently present in your paintings, which is the more sexual side of things, or at least, well, I suppose I will, I'll keep it with that, with the more sexual side of these things. Did you find that, like, are there other paintings you've got that you haven't? Because obviously these are just the ones that you have released to the world. I'm sure there are countless books and canvases and all kinds of things that other people can't necessarily see, or you've done for one reason or another to give to people, things like that. With them, do you find that when you went to draw these ones and you released them, did you notice that with inks and with graphite, you ended up drawing slightly different things to what you would naturally end up drawing with the paintings, just to the format and the styles you said? Or was this more of a, all of these pencil drawings, I drew all of them in like the same 2-year period? Like, I'm intrigued if there was, say, when you are drawing in yourself, is there a difference in what you actually come out with the different sort of formats, or is it more of just a coincidence from these collections?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say, I mean, they're also related and coming from myself, and they are actually drawn. A lot of these pieces, a couple of them are older, but most of them are from like that same kind of 2-year period of like that I feel maturing and kind of learning and growing in this world. And I would say that kind of the thing that can be kind of weird with the translation from a drawing to a painting, when I go back to similar subject matter, is that I do sometimes get maybe a little more insecure when I start painting a subject compared to when I start drawing it, because when I draw it, there's something inherently kind of removed about it, because drawing is much more, because it does, it's graphite and black and white, like you don't, it feels a little more like in that realm of like caricature, or like pushing towards something that like we're obviously not in, just like, gray tones with, squiggly lines. And so I feel a little freer to kind of probably get really intense with my subject matter, and then when I start painting it though, I can sometimes be like, whoa, all of a sudden I putting color and giving it more form, and feel maybe a little shyer about, like, oh wow, like people are really going to see this and see a body, but like I've been pushing through that. And I think I like that you point out Hymenium, because that is, that was a piece that was a little like, ooh, like, is this too much? But at the same time, like, I think that, while I can be a pretty shy, introverted person, my work kind of is a little confrontational and can be pretty like forward, and I like that about it. So yeah, I guess that's it. That color starts to make it feel a little more related to us, related to the world, since we are in color, and there's something that gives it a little more of a presence. And can also make it feel a little more like confrontational, where I feel like drawings you can kind of they're a little easier to like overlook because and this comes up a lot in the art world, the fine art world, that drawings don't nearly sell as well as like say paintings do, because paintings are just they have such a heavy physical presence, whereas drawings, they're a little lighter, they're literally on paper a lot of the times, and they're harder to preserve and keep safe, and they have to be behind glass, and so there's something kind of like delicate about them that I then with my subject matter, I'm like, let's make this really, like I don't care, I'm gonna go crazy with it. That starts to, I start to get a little more, I start to become a little more aware of what I was doing when I start painting it.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thanks for sharing that. And sort of within the same vein of what you are showing on your website and things, I assume there is a very large amount of art, either that's just in scrapbooks or things like that, or just elsewhere that isn't on this website. Mm-hmm. Is there actually sort of what has made you decide to not put certain things on there? I assume part of it is because this is also somewhat of our portfolio that you show people when you want to get a commercial or a paying job or that sort of sense. So I'm just intrigued by the sort of the selection process of what you have shown to the world in a way.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great question. It's a challenge to be like, what should I show? And it's usually not so much linked to subject matter, but maybe like level of finishedness, I guess I would say. It's like there's certain pieces where it's like I do so much drawing and painting, like quick studies and such, and I couldn't imagine, I'd probably like break the website, with how much it would like slow down trying to load it all. And I know people are interested in it, but it's like, it's kind of a tricky thing. Like, how do I display this without it just being like an endless scroll, right? Mm-hmm. So I try to, prioritize things that are pretty complete in like that I feel are complete, because there's still a lot of pieces that are works in progress that like I may be like still holding back on showing or showing the process of. But then I do every so often, I do think it's still valuable to show like, sketchbook paintings. There's a couple in there that are like in my sketchbook, literally, you can kind of see the edge of it. And because, I think I still, like, personally, I love to see art like that. I like to see a little of the behind the scenes of how an artist, thinks in their sketchbook versus like the big, complete finished thing. They're all very, they can kind of speak to each other in the process at large. So it's like, it's kind of balancing all of those elements.
It's funny because a lot of what you've been saying, I know they are both still realms of art, is I feel like, sorry. Have you got me back?
No, okay. Yeah, you're good now.
Yep, no problem. Sorry, I'll edit that small bit out. But with what you've been saying, it kind of links to music, I find, in a lot of ways, because you can kind of draw the lines in a lot of ways. There's a lot of music people make, but they never release to the world for one reason or another. There are songs that people release as singles, which are the big pieces, almost like an equivalent to a large art canvas, and there are things which are demos or B-sides or tracks on an album that they made for them, not for the public, but they're kind of releasing anyway, in a sense. And there's so many things that you've been saying, and I don't have any music out or anything, but it's like, it's one of the things that I believe that connects very well in that realm of art. And it's always, because art is so raw, both focusing on music and artwork in itself, is because they're both such raw things, and there's also a lot of interpretation, but also one can put a lot of controversy into it, and they can be very thinking pieces and things. Because it's something so personal to someone, and the theory being almost anyone could do it, in a sense, anyone can, in theory, put a pen on paper and draw something. And then also anyone, in theory, could say something with a beat in front of a microphone, in theory, and release it. So it's kind of that thing where it must be a very strange part where everyone can do it, but that you have something to show, but it's also, what is it that you want to show? What is it that you want to hold dear? And how much of yourself do you want to expose through such a raw yet somewhat removed medium?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think that's a really important conversation to be having in this moment, with with digital tools, like, with websites or social media or however you're like, putting your work out there. interfacing with the internet in some way, that's like a hard conversation because nobody's ever existed in a moment where it's so easy to just put your stuff out there and put it up there, you usually had to go through a lot of different, gatekeeping experiences in order to, get a single piece of art shown in a gallery or to like be, accepted into an orchestra for a epic classical piece, so it's never really been so easy to just kind of dump everything onto the internet. But then at the same time, it's like, I don't think that, I think we have to start to develop better curation, skills because, it's there are going to be the viewers who want to do like they want to know everything. They want to see the entire process. They're like just nerdy that way and love every bit of it. But like you're also trying to like make it accessible for the people who are kind of just they want to see the stars, right? The big hitters. And so I've been really struggling with that. And it's in part why I'm not on social media anymore because I was having a really hard time trying to navigate uploading work because sometimes I'd be like, oh, I want to upload like a finished painting and like I spent all this time on, and then I'd also upload like a little sketch that I would do, and it was really hard to kind of be doing both of those things and trying to keep up with the algorithm and all that stuff without it kind of distracting from the thing that's important, which is just making the stuff. So it's an ongoing process, and I'm still I'm not sure if I have the the full answer yet, but I'm trying my best to kind of just make work that I feel pretty good about, and like just keep that on my website in these groups of time periods. I think that can help. So then people who they just want to see the most recent thing, they can do that, or you can go into the deep dive, down the rabbit hole, if you will.
Yeah, it's one of those especially with social media, where it's a degree of instant feedback and also over a period of time feedback. I've posted stuff on Instagram and then I get someone commenting on it like years later, and I'm like, what were you doing to even find that? Were you on my timeline scrolling to the bottom? Did you click a hashtag and scroll back by 4 years? Why are you there? Whatever you're saying. And I've been quite fortunate where, apart from one or two small occasions, I've not really had many people saying negative things about my podcast, but then people have to actually spend quite a lot of time listening to my podcast to be able to critique it. Whereas with a song or one of your pieces of artwork, you need, obviously, to give a true critique, you need to actually look at it for a decent period of time. But even if someone looked at it for 15 seconds, they've seen enough of it to be able to say something negative about it if they so wanted to. And then it's also, I think anyone who puts themselves out there on the internet, with my podcast, for example, I'll have conversations. I'm like, that was one of the best I've ever had. It's going to be brilliant, amazing. And I don't dwell on the numbers. I don't really make a fuss about them or anything. It's not why I do my show. But I think, that one's barely had any. And then I have one stupid conversation with a mate of mine about nothing. And then it's like one of my most popular. And I'm like,
yes.
It's okay. I'm happy that anyone's listening. But we get certain ones where I'm like, why is that one? I spent like hours doing research on this one and all this stuff and so many insightful elements. And then this is me and my friend making fart jokes. And it's almost like with artwork, you could be like, I did this little doodle. It took me, 15 minutes while I was on a Zoom meeting call that I wasn't paying attention to. And then here's an art piece that I spent the last like 6 months doing, and it's really deep and means something to me, and I've got this really deep connection. And then the doodle goes viral and no one sees your painting, and you're like, that can be in itself, getting praise is nice and recognition, but it can be in a some direction that you would, it's not quite preferable. It's like, but I spent so long, this one's so important, and then you try and direct people and they're just in the stream, go in that other way.
Yeah, and I don't know, I mean, like, I definitely can feel demoralized by it, but like, I mean, can you feel that at all? Or, I mean, like, are you, pretty removed from the numbers?
No, it's something that I think every podcaster wants the numbers to be higher. And there was a time, I think it was around COVID, where I think across the board for podcasts, almost all of them dropped, apart from like the big, like
Really?
100. Yeah, it was. I think it's because what happened was where everyone was staying at home and the commuting went down so much that people cut out their B and C list podcasts and kept the heavy hitters. So things like, and I was guilty of it to a degree, when I could only listen to 5 hours of a podcast a week, rather than say 2 or 3 a day. The difference there would be I've got from 15 hours to 5. Well, if I don't overly as much anymore, not just because of the political reasons, but quality in general. I used to listen to a lot of Joe Rogan. That's how I got into podcasting, that and Scroobius Pip. So they were my go-to. I'd listen to them every episode constantly. And then, Rogan releases 4 a week, sometimes 3. They're like 3 hours long. And my commute used to be longer. And, since seeing Megan, since I've been with Megan, more of my free time is wanting to spend time with her rather than when I was single, especially, or not living with her, just doing chores around the house while I listen to a podcast. So with COVID especially, where commuting time cut down, a lot of the podcasts that people would listen to but weren't the easy listen. Rogan, for many of the faults, if you listen to any of the ones with his comedian friends, they're really easy listens. You don't really have to pay full attention. You can kind of be doing whatever, and it's just 2 people who are mates having a laugh about stupid things, so that's fine. But listening to a podcast that's either an intense audio drama or maybe even, when someone talks to someone who was on death row for 30 years and then got off death row because it was DNA evidence proved them not to be guilty. Like, those 2 conversations are so massively different, and you really have to be in a certain mindset. And I think that when you get to some of the more, in air quotes, important conversations compared to the more silly ones, in a sense, even though they both have equal but different value, I find what happened was, a lot of lower podcasters just lost. And the thing is with my show as well is that where I don't have a niche, it's not as easy. You get podcasts that come out and they've been around for 3 months and they'll be bigger than mine. I know by their numbers. I don't announce my numbers or anything. And it's not something that bothers me necessarily, but I'm just like, you're at this demographic, your thing is to do with this thing, and there's not much out about that. Mine is like, if you kind of like general stuff, just subscribe and there'll be episodes that pop up that you'll probably like. There's always going to be, every few weeks, there's going to be something you enjoy, but it's just taking the plunge to try and listen to things you may not expect in a way. So for my podcast, it is slightly different, but from what I understand from a lot of indie podcasters, there was a hit when commute times went down for COVID. Certain shows skyrocketed. True crime, I think, got even more popular, but true crime was already in the upper echelon. So it was just like certain demographics of people who were doing certain things while listening to podcasts. It just kind of changed that slightly. And then when you had it where every celebrity on the planet decided they should do a podcast, then it immediately stamped everyone else down. So in that realm, it's slightly different.
Yeah, no, well, and that's so interesting that you say that, because I it's different, but I can relate in the sense of being a generalist can be really hard in this day and age. But it's like I feel like I'm committed to it because, I myself want to be exploring a lot of different things and be in a wide breadth of subjects and materials and things. But that is really hard because these algorithms and the way that things get marketed in the way that our society is structured, it's really hard to be somebody who's doing a lot of stuff and having a really kind of, many different kinds of complex conversations, and then to be like, oh, but people, in some ways, you can see the success of people who just are laser focused on one topic and just do that constantly. And I can sometimes feel envious of the people who can do that in their art. I would see these, very popular Instagram artists and such, and be like, every single post is pretty much a variation of the last thing that they posted, and it's a very successable business model, but I couldn't do it just for the fact of I'd get bored, and so I find it's that was part of my, again, that drive to kind of step away from social media, because I was finding that I was conflating what kind of work should I be making, and are people, but ultimately it's really hard to judge that from those numbers, because the algorithm can kind of it just kind of favors certain kinds of ways of working over the others, and it doesn't invalidate being a generalist or having a lot of different interests. It just kind of means that it's not as easy to market you to a single audience. And so I've definitely struggled with that, and it's interesting to hear that there's something like that in podcasting as well.
Yeah, it's interesting where podcasting, although podcasting is a degree of an art form. Mine, it makes me sound pretentious, but it's always like mine probably is, but it's more like my whole thing is literally just, this is an excuse for me to talk to people I deem interesting, and I just release it on the internet and put very detailed show notes, as my audience seem to tell me, and very so I can never not do it anymore. So
Right.
it's one of those things where I've thought about it before of ways I could become more popular in air quotes and things like that. I mean, I don't really share many political opinions on this. I talk about my general opinions on certain things, but when I have a guest on who I don't agree with, I don't necessarily cause a lot of fuss. I'll challenge them in some ways. I generally don't seek them out. I've had people before who've said, "Oh, you should talk to this person because they think completely opposite to you in this." And it's like, I do like a debate, but I prefer it with a friend of mine when it's about movies or something inconsequential. And the problem is, I've had it where I could have lots of controversial conversations about, I don't know, my opinion on the legality of drugs. You know, I think most of them should be legal. I think I figured out a vague system of it. There's a vast majority of reasons in why of things. But I kind of mention those occasionally when they come up. And there have been times I've spoken to individuals. There's one, Gerardo Urias, I spoke with, I think the start of 2021. And he was speaking about psilocybin mushrooms and how they helped him get out of a really dark place and all these kind of things. And it's a common theme I've heard quite a lot. So obviously speaking with him, I spoke about some of my opinions on that element, but do I want to have an argument with someone who's very anti-drugs and then them go into the minutiae of the political side of things and the economics and all this sort of stuff, and potentially have done a lot more research than I have, and then they make me look stupid, or then I make someone else look stupid, and it's like I don't want to do those things. I'm just conversation. That's it. I just want to chat with someone like I would be like. It's almost trying to shortcut being friends with someone, because if I just said to you, "Hey, I basically barely know you. Can I come in your house and chat with you for 2 hours?" You'd be like,
Right.
Probably not. But if I'm like, well, I've got a podcast, I've got a certain amount of people listening, we've got people who we know through each other. It's not going to be horrendous. One would hope. So with that, it kind of fast tracks me to be able to just ask people certain questions, and they're in this scenario where I think I remember someone discussing almost like the like Louis Theroux. Do you know who Louis? Yeah.
Oh wait, no. Do I?
Wait, the director. He's very mild mannered with glasses. He did something on the he did one on Church of Scientology called My Scientology Movie. That was pretty cool. He did something Mornings with. He's a British filmmaker basically, and he's quite mild mannered. You may have seen him in certain things. Everyone in Britain knows who he is, and when he talks to certain people, he's very calm and he's very polite about things, but he does ask fairly deep questions to certain individuals. And people have said it's almost like him at the end of a party. You know, if you're at a party, especially in sort of college-ish time, and there's like a house party, when it gets to like 2 or 3 in the morning and there's just a few people left, a lot of the time it's these deep, sometimes crazy conversations that go down crazy rabbit holes. And it's almost a thing like that for me. Is my excuse is I could spend a lot of money trying to advertise my podcast, or I could try and get certain guests, or there's like hot topics that come out where people are talking about this thing, and it's like I could specifically orchestrate a conversation with one of my podcasting friends or someone random to talk about, you know, what's going on with this is dating it now, but for example, when COVID was happening, the Black Lives Matter movement and George Floyd and all that sort of stuff. And I was like, if it comes up in conversation, I will talk about it, but I don't want for my show to be reactive. I just want it to be, let's just talk to people. The conversation in itself will somewhat date it just from a degree of cultural references that are said. But unless the conversation is specifically about this type of movie or that specific subject, I just want to be free from all those sort of things. And it's been a thing I've thought about before. And it's a similar thing with art. Like you could, if you are in music, you can just make advert music and things like that forever, and radio jingles. I know it's not quite this simple to clarify. I'm not saying just tomorrow wake up and make radio jingles and live on it, you know, but the direction which you can aim, you could just go for almost any art piece or any comic book or any person who confronts you. You could almost try anything. And there's one thing that you said in the conversation with Reburn that I wonder if you could sort of repeat, which is something that you've learned from being in the industry, and choosing is not a problem, choosing what you want to do and saying no occasionally. So I wonder if you could give us a little bit of insight into that, because you said it quite eloquently in the last time we chatted.
Yeah, no, well, I don't know how I said it then, but I mean, I do just really, I'm very firmly in this mindset that like we should be curating like what's important to us, because it's like, you know, it can be a really good business model, a really good, tactic to just kind of like, I'm just going to do this same thing, be really predictable and really easy for like, a marketing person to know what I am and what I'm about. And then, you can secure work, and that's like, there's nothing wrong with that or having phases of that in your life. But like, I also am so of the mindset that being really versatile and having a lot of different interests, and then also finding the people who are kind of on that same page is actually going to lead to a lot more fruitful of results in the long run. We're talking about this, and I think that, it can feel like in the short term, like, you're not making much progress, or like, look at those people who are like succeeding in that way. But I have found, with a lot of people who existed before us, a lot of the painters that I loved or artists that I admire, they were kind of investing in this long-term philosophy. And those kinds of like, those deeper kinds of conversations of like, I, these are related to my values. These are related to my the bigger picture of what I like want to be known for as an artist and such. That kind of stuff doesn't come, in a week of planning. It doesn't just come like after a month, or, it's not, you're aiming for a big goal. And so I kind of have been trying to, be at peace with who I am, and knowing that like, it may not come right away, that success, but if you hold true to it, it will pay off, and you'll always be satisfied, because at least you're being true to like yourself and the work you want to make. Otherwise, you can really easily find yourself in situations and projects that don't align with what you're about, and it can burn you out, and it can actually kill your love for the thing that brought you into it. And at that point, like, what's the point then, if you just like, you went into illustration and you burned yourself out because you took on all these jobs that were just soulless. And then all of a sudden it's like, you hate drawing, you hate illustration, and you never want to look at it again. I've met people who that happened to them, and it's like, well, I guess, maybe I'll have a few less jobs. Maybe I have to take on a part-time job somewhere else. Maybe I have to do some seasonal stuff. But like, at least I still retain the thing that is most important to me, which is this love of this work that I do.
Yeah, the passion. If you're in the world of arts, I think you should be there for you.
Yeah.
First, and second of that is whatever your secondary objective is. Is it to draw for Marvel, or is it to be known as the greatest comic artist of all time, or is it to do lots of crazy weird horror stuff, or is it just to make enough money to survive but try and sell as many of your own paintings as possible? Everyone's got their own goal. The ones I started with were obviously the more extreme end, and the other ones were sort of more on the other end, and it's just kind of where one wants to be whenever you enter a world of arts.
Yeah, it's all valid, like, but I think the trickiest part is like tuning out everybody else's like opinions and really getting to the heart of like, what are you really about? Like, it's hard to know yourself. And, I feel fortunate to have like, I feel like I'm in a much better place, but I got there because I just kept making the stuff and finding like, okay, I'm at peace with this.
Oh, totally. Yeah. And we'll start to wrap up here, because we're past the 90-minute mark. I feel like we could talk about this sort of stuff forever, but I do have, it's amazing. Yeah, thank you very much for coming on. But I do want to ask I've got sort of maybe one more question, and that was, with art in itself, linking in with what you were just saying there, do you find that in doing art, excluding the professional and paid side of things, just you doing your own artwork, whether or not you put it on your website or not, just for your own introspection, when you finish and you put down the paintbrush or the pencil or whatever, do you find that you just expressing yourself in that way helps you grow as a person, just getting some of that out?
Oh my God. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I mean, like, and I could go on and on about that too, but like, it's such an important thing to me. And that's why I really have this philosophy of like safeguarding it, because the reason I do it is to kind of cope with, the struggles of being a person, or, and existing in this really, this stressful experience that we call life. And, having art can, it's like, it's the way that, I wake up and I'm like, oh, I look forward to this thing, or like I feel like energized after these conversations, and like stuff like this too, I think it's a beautiful thing. And like you were talking earlier, like yeah, I'm like a shy and introverted person, but like when it comes to art, like I just open up because it's like it's passion, and I think that that's the power of it, that like it can change who you think you are just by means of like doing it. And it's cool, it's really, really cool. So that's why, for any like young creators, or even, people who just need to hear it, it's like, you don't like, it's so hard, like we do have to like make money and survive and live and such, but like try your best to also safeguard that part of yourself, because like it's not worth it if it's like you just hate it, if it's tied to all the things that make your life stressful. It's like that it's important to just to like live, and have that there, it's a sort of like its own kind of therapy.
Yeah, it's your art should be expression. That should be the number one thing. Then worry about monetization if you can, but don't swap what you gain from it personally for money, because it will, even if it seems better for the first few years, at some point it will become not worth it. And as you eloquently put sort of before, if you go into illustration with the intention that I love art, I want to go do a career in it, and then by the end of your career you're like, I hate art, well then all you've done is basically work a job you don't like and lost a hobby. You could have just worked in like a call center or a shop or something, and there's nothing wrong with either of those two jobs, how however they want to work and make money. But it's like myself, I work in insurance. I'm like everyone I work with. It's fine. It's a job that I have lots of things I like about it with. And because of this job, I have the time to be able to do podcasting as a side. I could have a job that could earn me way more money, but I would have a lot less time and a lot less freedom to be able to live the way I want to live with myself, with Megan, and just podcasting in general. So it's always like, especially for young people, I think is quite a big thing, especially because that's what schools kind of push quite a lot. And it's just like, just make enough money to live and see what you kind of want to do and vaguely go from there. Because if you aim for making so much money that you can buy your own island, or, obviously that's me being over the top, but, kids are like, oh, I want to buy my own house outright immediately. And you're like, well, you're either setting yourself up for fail, or you're going to have to work so hard for the first decade of your life. You're going to just burn yourself out. Just, my kind of advice, and when I have kids and things, it will be, do a job either that you're passionate about and that you want to genuinely do, or do something that you don't hate, but spend the rest of your time doing something that you actually want to do. And if you're lucky and you go down that second path, eventually you're, a lot of people call it like a side hustle, that can generate revenue. And like my goal of podcasting is, maybe if I'm lucky in 5 more years, maybe I'll make enough money from Patreon or whatever. I don't monetize it at the moment or anything, but it's like, maybe in the future I would. And if I did do that and I made enough money, I could just reduce my hours at work by a day. That would be great. If I get an extra day of the week and I get to just, from podcasting, do that. That would be amazing. I would love to be a full-time podcaster, but it's so, unless you're basically already famous, it's near on impossible for the vast majority of people, like it is for a lot of other professions. So I will just say, with like everything you've been saying, it's very inspiring hearing about sort of your perspectives on all of these different aspects of art and hearing how passionate you are on things. And obviously people, we spoke about Reburn in the previous conversation, so I will link to that. Make sure you go check that out. But, if you want to pick up some of Elise's work, and it's, made with an incredible individual, Alyson Shelton, and also producer editor Jessica Patel, and other individuals as well involved in that process. But like, the three of you were sort of the cornerstones of that, the project getting a physical release, getting things that people actually get to see. And if people want to support you, they can obviously check that out, and I do highly recommend, because it's amazing. But also your website, I've mentioned it quite a lot in this conversation, but it costs you nothing to go on Elise's website and just have a look. It's great fun.
And that's the most rewarding thing, is just to like, if you just look at the work, you know, and you take something away from it. That's like on, I mean, and literally everything that you've said, Mike, I mean, has been really, you know, just super like gratifying to hear. So like, thank you, you know, for this conversation. Cause it's like, oh, you know, like I could be toiling away in the studio for hours and be like, is any of this even coming across, you know, and feel like I'm just kind of talking to myself. But, you know, it's like these kinds of, you know, connections that really, you know, like are fulfilling and like, oh, yay, yes, it's coming across. So thank you.
No problem at all. It's generally been a delight, and just looking at your artwork and things, I was so excited when I spoke with Alyson the first time, and I looked into more of your work and things. I was just so excited that we could have this conversation just about it, because I had so many questions and things that you've, you know, very honestly and openly answered that I hugely appreciate, and I know my audience will really appreciate your openness and honesty on this show, because I know how, you know, as we've discussed, how raw art is. So before I sort of wrap this up, is there just any final words you want to say to any of the listeners, or anything else? It can be long or as short as you want. The floor is yours. We'll say about your website, and then we'll hang this up.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, just, you know, I'm just thankful for this conversation. And, you know, if you want to see more of my work, you know, I'm not on social media, but my website's the best way to find my work and to look at it. And I also have a little newsletter that I've started up. So if you're at all a newsletter person, you know, it's a little old fashioned, I know, but, you know, I kind of have started to really like them. So there's always that as an option too, if you want to hear more about my work.
Fantastic. I've already signed up, actually. I realised I hadn't done, so I did it in this conversation. So we've done that. It's amazing.
Well, thank you.
It's all right. I'm looking forward to seeing more of your artwork and things. I just want to be notified of anything else that you come out with, because it is genuinely, I swear to you, the reason I wanted to have you on the show was you know, I was impressed by the Reburn comic, but more specifically when I saw the paintings and the graphites and things, when I saw those and the range of them and the, you know, how raw they were in a way, without being a rawness, while being provocative in the right amount, in a sense, without it being overly gratuitous. And I just really appreciated it, and I could see patterns there. So I just wanted to speak with you about it, because, as you say, getting to know the artist and getting to know the process is always something I'm very intrigued by when it comes to people in different artistic forms. I always just love hearing about how they make things. So, you know, thank you for coming on the show. I do hugely appreciate you spending the time to speak to me, both this time and when we spoke before. And it's an open invitation. If you ever want to come back and talk about anything in particular, anything specific, or if you've got some new project that you want to help promote or anything like that, always welcome to contact. I know all of my listeners would love to hear it as well.
Well, thank you so much.